First of all, I would like to acknowledge the beautiful country that we're on today. I'd like to acknowledge I'm on Wurundjeri country of the Kulin Nation, acknowledge elders past and present, elders from other cultures and emerging young Aboriginal leaders. This is and always will be Aboriginal land, and this land was never ceded. My name is Deb Savaris and I'm the CEO of the Centre for Excellence, and I'm going to MC this hour-long session on a lovely Friday. Today's webinar is part of the Tri-Peaks project, which is a collaboration between the Centre for Excellence in Child and Family Welfare, the Victorian Healthcare Association, and the Victorian Alcohol and Drug Association to support integrated practice and good governance across our three sectors. And many of you would have been to a number of our sessions over the course of this year that have been exceptional, and we've had some real talent presenting to us along the way, and today is no exception. This is a Zoom webinar, so please use the chat and QA functions for your questions and comments. And at the end, if we have time, we'll come to those, and some of them might be able to be answered along the way, but hopefully we'll have a bit of time at the end. In today's webinar, Sarah Patterson, General Manager of Victoria at ThinkPlace, will be presenting on the state of social innovation. The state of social innovation is a special ThinkPlace report. When we talk about innovation, we are talking about new ways of thinking, acting and collaborating that unlock better outcomes for the people for whom we work. At this time, innovation matters more than ever to enable us to respond to the size and nature of the challenges that we are facing in Australia, in Victoria and globally. Sarah and Karls will draw on ThinkPlace's experience of running innovation processes globally and present on the pulse of leaders, the myths of innovation labs, why social innovation attempts fail and how to avoid this, and what innovation could look like for you and your organisation. So now to introduce our speakers. Sarah Patterson. So Sarah Patterson, I'm just going to make sure I've actually got my notes in order because I'm reading directly from them. Sarah leads ThinkPlace's Victorian studio in delivering local, national and international work, and brings deep expertise in facilitating co-design engagements that traverse policy and technical environments. She's dedicated the last 15 years across both government and corporate contexts to improve the lives of Australians, whether through policy, technical or design interfaces and other things. Her background is diverse, having piloted and implemented social policy projects with the Australian Department of Employment for almost a decade before transitioning to architecture and eventually human-centred design. For the last 3 years at ThinkPlace, Sarah has led strategic engagements to positively amplify social impacts for clients such as the Australian Communications and Media Authority, the CSIRO, ARENA, SA Power Networks, the University of Melbourne, and the Victorian Department of Environment, Land, Planning and Water, and actually the EPA. Sarah is a skilled researcher and visual communicator, as well as a dynamic facilitator. She's a strong bias towards action and outcomes rather than process, and draws from a range of experience designing and facilitating social innovation labs, such as ARENA's A-Lab, the Water Services Association of Australia W-Lab, and the Global Unleash program. And I've made it all sound very complicated, but I suspect that we're going to have this made really simple for us from our presenters today. Karls James. Karls is driven by actively and creatively approaches to solve complex social problems through local knowledge. And we all know here today, for many of us, that local's been incredibly important during this pandemic. And she's a wholehearted believer in the idea that those for whom you are designing should be those with whom you design. A published cultural anthropologist and design researcher, Karls has led numerous design processes within the humanitarian and development sectors. As a senior executive designer, she has worked with clients in East and West Africa, Australia, Europe, the US and Singapore to design human-centred solutions to complex problems in financial inclusion, education and sexual and reproductive health. In her time at ThinkPlace, Karls has worked on a variety of projects, including designing a communication strategy that promoted uptake of oral administered HIV prevention medication for high-risk populations in rural Kenya, applying systems thinking and complexity theory to rethink and redesign the operating model for the global humanitarian sector, conducting immersive research on the prevailing fundraising behaviours of rural Kenyans in order to design a more inclusive product for a digital fundraising platform, and a comprehensive website redesign and content rewrite for the Australian government. These are really complex projects, and having worked with ThinkPlace, I know how they can make it easy for us to engage and get a fantastic product at the end. Karls holds a master's degree in design studies from Harvard University, a master's degree in social cultural anthropology from McGill University, and a bachelor's degree with honours in cultural anthropology, French and international studies. These are two amazing women. We're very, very grateful to have them here today. I'm going to hand over to them, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy this session and hopefully some time for questions at the end. There will be a bit of a Slido session, I want to warn you, for those who love Slido during the course of this presentation, and there'll be some instruction on the screen for you should you not be familiar with it. Thanks very much.
What a fantastic welcome. Thank you so much, Deb. I am so excited to be here and speaking with you today. I have spoken with Emma a lot about what you've been covering in the webinar series so far, and it really sounds incredible that you've had some amazing minds come together around an issue which is so important to us dealing with the big challenges that we have ahead of us as a society, which is governance and relationships and partnerships and how you do them really well. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm meeting you from today, and that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today. I also want to acknowledge that there's 65,000 plus years of history that First Nations people in Australia hold. And I truly believe that the solutions to many of the problems that we're grappling with come from us educating ourselves on that history and that knowledge. Deb's given you a fantastic overview from both Carly and I, but I thought I would very briefly introduce you to my journey.
Sorry, Sarah, you're just on presenter view, if you wanted to just quickly fix that.
Thank you. Can you now see my full screen?
Yeah,
perfect.
Great, thanks, Ollie. So I thought I'd very briefly take you through my journey. My journey to social innovation actually began in the federal public service. I joined as a cadet and quickly became very familiar with our social policy in Australia. I was specifically focused in welfare, but had the absolute pleasure of working within the team that introduced the social inclusion definition to legislation way back when. In government, I also transitioned across into working in the Pacific with an aid and remittance program that we established as a pilot and then transitioned into a full-time program. It's called the Seasonal Worker Program, and it involves people coming from the Pacific Islands to work in Australia and gain really vital skills, and most importantly, remittance that they can send home and use to create new businesses and new enterprises in the Pacific. That little cross on the map is me as a 20-something-year-old having a little bit of an existential crisis. And during that time, I decided to grapple with design a little. So I studied graphic design and I fell in love with it. I did not love designing websites though. And this was at a time where design was really turning virtual. So I looked to a design practice that would always be physical, and that was architecture. I practiced that for several years in Canberra and then found my place at ThinkPlace, which is where I get to combine that thinking around social policy with design and the design discipline. And I'm particularly passionate about partnerships and SDG 11, which is all around how do you form really well-functioning relationships to achieve the SDG goals. Carlin, I might hand to you to introduce yourself next, if that's okay.
Sure. We're still seeing your journey there, Sarah. Oh, great. Hi, everyone. My name's Carly James. My full name's Carlin. I go by either. I'm calling in from Canberra today. My signature, of course, says ThinkPlace Kenya. I've been living and working internationally now for about 8 years. I've been fortunate to be with ThinkPlace for about 6, and just recently transitioned out of the Kenya office through the shuffle of COVID and various other travel restrictions and things, made my transition back to the Australia office. So my entry into social innovation really started through sociocultural anthropology. I was doing my master's fieldwork in East and West Africa, and I was really, I think there's this unfair notion sometimes that people who are extremely low income don't have sort of responsible or sound habits around money sharing and banking and these sorts of things. And I was really interested to kind of poke around that in my research. Now, of course, we know that contrary to that belief, there are a whole host of informal ways that informal being outside of sort of formal banking institutions, that people exchange value with one another. And I was really interested in researching those kinds of informal credit and debt systems, which really serve to strengthen social bonds locally. So you know, definitely a lot of powerful lessons and examples there around social innovation and how we sort of have all these creative approaches to solving problems in our own ways locally. So lots of learnings there. Through that experience, I crossed paths with someone from ThinkPlace. I had the fortune of meeting someone who was just beginning some work in Kenya at the time, and our focus was on microfinance. So there were sort of some clear connections there. And I started working at ThinkPlace shortly thereafter. I came over to the Australia office, the Canberra office, got started working at ThinkPlace, and was really attracted to the idea, of course, of research and immersive qualitative research and kind of the design angle, and really caught the bug on sort of the execution side of things, and wanted to continue my studies in design. So went back to the US for a little while to the Harvard Graduate School of Design, studied there for about a year, and then started in our ThinkPlace Kenya office, which was just getting off the ground at the time. So through that experience, I had the pleasure of working on a whole range of projects, which Deb was kind to give you a few highlights from, all throughout sub-Saharan Africa. And a lot of our portfolio work really focuses on this idea of leveraging sociocultural norms, of what things that people are already doing and accustomed to, and motivators that they already have, and sort of leveraging that to stimulate lasting positive behavior change. So that's a little about me. Just in the last few months, I've sort of been hopping, like I said, from our Kenya studio to a little bit of work with our US team, and now back in Australia. Pleasure to be with you.
Thanks, Carly. And for those of you who aren't familiar with ThinkPlace, very briefly, we're a global network. We span 10 studios across 5 different countries. On most all of our projects, we use design-led, human-centered design approaches to tackle some of the world's most challenging problems. We have recently adopted the Sustainable Development Goals as our guiding light. What that means is that every project that we are involved in at ThinkPlace needs to have a mandate of some kind towards shifting the needle on one or more sustainable development goal. We engage with the complexity and the messiness of the modern world. We look at how people live, work, and play, how they experience services, products, and policies, and how they navigate the systems that they interact with. In fact, we kind of fall in love with those systems. I was listening to an amazing panelist last week speak, and she said the best way to tackle a complex problem is to fall in love with it. And I 100% agree with that. But today we're here to talk to you about social innovation. So recently we had a go at our very first report at ThinkPlace, and it's a report that really looks at the state of social innovation. Why social innovation, what is social innovation, and what you can do about it. As a part of that report, which I'll be taking you through very slowly today, we'll cover each of those topics one by one, at the heart of it is a survey that we did. We went out to over 100 change makers around the world within our networks. They spanned a whole range of sectors that you can see there on the screen, and the majority identified as either CEO or senior executive management. What we were interested in understanding is, what is the nature of the problems they're solving right now? How complex are they, and what are the challenges they're facing in terms of dealing with those problems? I'm just going to show you very briefly a snapshot of the survey results. This is just the first few questions, but what it points to is that people today are tackling problems that are increasingly complex and bordering on chaotic. If this year tells us anything, we have almost jumped into that space of chaos. And what we know about complex problems is they can't be tackled alone. In Victoria, I understand that you've got huge problems that you're grappling with, you know, whether that be trying to find permanent housing for people who were temporarily placed into housing during COVID, to maximising the value that you can create through this incredible increase in health funding that the Victorian government has just announced in their budget, to partnering on really ambitious goals around, you know, alcohol and drug addiction. And we know that that is a domain that spans multiple systems, from education to health and to employment as well. We also know that government and donor procurement processes are more and more requiring or mandating that you partner with others. And that leaders in your sectors have really ambitious goals that they're looking to tackle, not alone, but with others. So that's where social innovation really comes into play. I'm going to pause here for a moment and introduce you to a concept I only learned about yesterday. It's called Slam Chat, and we're going to use the Q&A function today, if that's possible, Ollie. I'm looking for an option for people to enter a word but not hit send. And what I'd love you to think about is, when you look at those two words, social innovation, what is the first thing that comes to mind? If you could enter that into the chat or the Q&A right now, but not send it, that would be fantastic. Okay, has everyone got their chat in? I can't see people. So Ollie, are people looking positive and ready to go?
Ready to go.
All right, ready? Hit send. Improvement, positive change, solutions, community, culture, community inspiration, ideas. Fantastic. Those are all concepts that we bring into social innovation, and creative thought is also one. Thanks, Katrina. It is a lot. We can describe it a lot more simply than it sounds. So Deb, we've got you covered there. I'm sure that a few of us in the room have been involved in less than ideal partnerships before, whether that be because you were forced to very quickly establish a partnership to get a tender in on time, or whether someone who you really didn't know approached you with a lot of enthusiasm and motivation, and you felt that you really needed to jump in and have a go. There are some common pitfalls to that, and we'll talk to that soon, but in terms of the social innovation approach, I see it as an antidote to those sorts of partnerships, the partnerships that are formed just around convenience. The images that you can see right now are from some of the Innovation Lab events we've held for the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, ARENA, in their A-Lab, which is a social innovation lab that we designed in partnership with ARENA and Marchmont Hill Consulting. What you'll see is a lot of action. What you'll see is a lot of people grouped together. What you'll see is people grappling with the system, like up in that top right-hand corner. They are people who are trying to map what the system looks like. We ask people to engage very, very deeply in a problem space. We make the events highly focused and very structured, and we place a real action on bias. Bias on action. What that means is that people are forced to take a break from everyday life, and they're forced to really focus in on what matters. And by putting people in a problem space for a little longer than usual, we find that we can start to define not just solutions that we can find within the current system, but we start to define an entirely new system that we can work towards. So this is what the process looks like at a very high level, and I'd encourage you to read the report if you're interested in getting into the detail. This is a short presentation today, so I won't take you through every step. But the most important thing is the items in green are all where we're dealing with the problem space, and you'll notice that that's about 80% of the process. It means that we're forcing people to go against human nature, which is to solve a problem. We're forcing them to stay in a place that's really uncomfortable, but we provide an environment that is conducive to it and helps people. And we arm them with the tools and techniques that they need to zoom in on a problem, to understand any patterns within it, to think about the sorts of people they'll need to work with to tackle that problem, and then to imagine a shared vision of the future together. And that's before we even start to think about solutions. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit now around what some of those critical make or break areas are when it comes to social innovation. And when I'm talking to social innovation today, I'm really focused quite heavily on relationships, because what I'm hearing when I talk to people within your sectors is that that seems to be the biggest challenge that you're grappling with at the moment, is how do you get started with a relationship? How do you build and maintain, and how do you keep those relationships really strong when some of the programs you might be running will spend 5 to 10 years? So some of the common pitfalls are that we often agree to partner without laying the groundwork. And what that means is that we're likely to find that there's been a misalignment between roles, responsibilities, and the tasks that we give each other within a team. So the strengths within a team aren't always optimized completely. It's also a missed opportunity to understand each other's interests. When you spend time up front identifying strengths, weaknesses, interests, what each party is coming to the table to achieve, you find that others are then able and empowered to advocate for you in a partnership. And we've also noticed that it can create a misalignment around purpose, value, or intent when it comes to the partnering organisations. And that doesn't always surface in that honeymoon period where you're first getting started in a relationship. It often surfaces in the really high pressure, critical times in a project. So the image I'm showing you here is a fantastic image that looks at the typical and probably the ideal partnering process. And it was established by the Partnership Brokers Association, of which I'm a part of. What you'll notice is that half of that entire cycle is focused on that space of laying the groundwork. And the remaining is around reviewing and applying reflective practice. Carly, I'll throw to you for the next one.
Yeah, sure. It just follows on directly from what you were just saying there, Sarah. So, failing to identify and address any misalignment in values between your sponsor and your partners is a big one. I'm sure we've all experienced. I think, it's standard to go through a misalignment, say in expectations or delivery timeframes or what have you. But a misalignment in values can often feel even more complex or sometimes more intractable. So how do we go about addressing this? It's something that I've experienced personally quite often in the international space, where you've got sort of donor expectations, which might come tied with, a set of values. You've got sort of the HQ team sitting in some major urban center like London or Paris or DC. You've got sort of country level teams, field level teams, and everyone sort of has a different set of values and a different way of approaching the same problem together. So how do we work through that? One thing we like to talk about is understanding values as drivers. So really kind of what's motivating people, what are their priorities, why are they here, what fulfills them, what do they want to be working on, what excites them, and sort of understanding sort of people on that level really helps to, like Sarah was saying, kind of kickstart that relationship building process. So I'll just share a really quick case study from our team in Kenya. So that's what's on the screen there. We were working with Plan International. They're a global international non-governmental organization, INGO. They're operating in about 75 different countries, and they're focused on global health. Their HQ is in London, which is important from that sort of what is that value set and that mindset kind of perspective. So we started out this project by recognizing that the teams who are delivering work locally are often really vastly different in composition and background than those who are advancing the strategic goals or the priorities of that work in other parts of the world. So there's kind of this trickling down of priorities and expectations down from the funder all the way through to these country teams. So Plan had these policies around gender equality, gender equity, safeguarding, empowerment that they were sort of wanting to diffuse throughout their work, but realized that it's kind of articulated really differently across country contexts. So not only from the international down to the local, but also even, say within Kenya, there's a massive difference between urban and rural and peri-urban and what those value sets are. So our design challenge was the first picture there at the top. So how might we help Plan International sensitively diffuse those values globally to foster equality and opportunity for girls worldwide? So we came up with a prototype which actually ended up winning an award, which is great. It's called Lesson in a Box, and I won't have time to go into it too much today, but after a whole host of research across a number of different contexts, we came up with sort of a learning curriculum and a learning package that would essentially allow people to just have conversations and just help them through those kind of difficult, intractable, or seemingly intractable issues and tough conversations that we all need to have around these types of things. Back to you, Sarah.
Sorry to make you dizzy there. I just had an issue with my slides, but I think it's stable now. The third kind of common pitfall or challenge that we see when we come into work with consortia or partnerships or in things like the Arena A-Lab is that there's a real benefit in having partnerships with people at your peer level. Because you actually get to learn from each other. You learn new techniques, you learn new concepts and new models. And if you hit the set and forget button and forget about reflecting together and maintaining that relationship together, you really miss out on that opportunity. It became really clear to me over the weekend. I was involved in Unleash, which is a global innovation lab which runs every year. It gets over 1,200 participants globally involved in ideating and creating solutions to really complex challenges, specifically around the Sustainable Development Goals. And one of the things that I love most about being a part of that partnership in facilitating Unleash is that I get to learn from other facilitators. I get to learn tips, tricks, techniques. The Slam Chat was one of those things that I learned. So a common thing we find is that people are missing out on that opportunity to reflect and learn from others. Social innovation means that we're creating deliberate time together to consider and innovate within the process. And Carly will talk a little bit more about what that means to innovate a process later on today. But it's proven to create far better outcomes when you've got someone who's got an eye on that process. The picture you're seeing there is that happening in action. It's a huddle between the 5 facilitators at that particular Arena A-Lab event. And what we're doing is between the break, we're working out what happens next. We've had some unexpected things come through from participants, new ideas that we weren't anticipating, and they're not quite as far stretched as we'd like them to be. And so that's a conversation about, well, how do we get people to stretch their thinking a little further? And it was incredibly beneficial in terms of the ideas that came out of that particular session. We're going to throw you into a little bit of a design challenge next, and I'll ask Ollie to help by providing the link and the codes in the chat for you. Importantly, I want you to pick just one of those codes, and hopefully not everyone picks the first one, but it would be great if you could jump into just one of those Slido polls. So you'll need to go to www.slido.com, and I can screen share that for you in just a moment. And you'll need to enter one of the following event codes. So just one. Be great if you can kind of pick it at random so that we don't have everyone in the same event. I'm going to give you a moment now to do that. And while I'm doing it, I'll switch my screen share so that you can see what Slido looks like for anyone who's not yet used it. Okay, Carly, I'm going to screen share some of the results and throw over to you.
Great, let's see what we have.
So this is the first poll.
Okay, so this one is focusing on an aviation crew. So what kind of qualities or what standards, what ways of working really help them to be most successful? So honesty, we've got communication, great. Okay, let's see what the next one says. The next one was a well-functioning family unit, and we told you to imagine you're going to their Christmas reunion or family reunion barbecue. What would it feel like? What would it look like? What makes a strong family unit? So stability, communication, listening, cohesion, non-judgmental again. Great. How about the next one? This one is focusing on a well-functioning top-end restaurant. So we asked you to think about front of house, back of house, how everything works together. Looks like we had the most responses for this one. Common purpose is a good one. Friendly, professional understanding. We've got communication yet again as one of the strongest ones coming out. Great. So I suppose it's pretty obvious why we asked you to do this exercise. We were hoping to give you kind of different lenses or different frames with which to think about collaboration or partnerships or relationship building or what have you, just sort of any kind of moment where you've got a diverse group of people who are trying to work together and achieve the same goal and have this kind of shared vision and shared way of working. Any quick reflections on that? I know it's hard to throw to such a large group, but would anyone like to share some initial reflections? I don't know if we can do that on the webinar format.
You can pop them in the chat or the Q&A.
Yeah, throw them in the chat. How about that? And we can discuss at the end if we've got some extra time. So Sarah, I'll just ask you to go to the next slide. Yeah, so what can we learn from this exercise? We pulled out 3 lessons and things we wanted to kind of share as takeaways, but I'm sure there are plenty more. So the first is that emphasis on a shared intent or shared vision. So, what's really driving the change that we're trying to make together? How do we kind of build consensus around something without going so high level and sort of reaching such a high level consensus around something that it then becomes meaningless? This is actually something we do at ThinkPlace, and we're really intentional about when we sort of encourage people to start these relationships and these partnerships, because it actually ends up de-risking the process later on. So if you've kind of got that shared understanding of what you're all working toward, whether that's delivering a good meal for people or operating a safe flight or whatever it might be, you're more likely to perform much more efficiently and sort of at that high performance level. The next one we called out as individual experience can be a limiting factor. So this one, I suppose, if you are familiar with systems thinking or you've heard anyone from ThinkPlace talk, you probably are familiar with this concept of the idea that we all come to a problem or come to a challenge, of course, from different perspectives, different experiences. But really kind of opening ourselves up and recognizing that there are different perspectives on the same thing. It sounds kind of intuitive, but it does take work, it does take effort, really allows us to be more accurate and more realistic in the way that we work. The last one is that the entire process, of course, is embedded in relationships. I think we've kind of nodded to this a couple times now, that the process really doesn't exist except for in relationships. It's really kind of places an emphasis on relationship building, and it's one big sort of exercise in doing that. I'll just quickly share, I don't want to spend too much time, but quickly share another case study with you from our ThinkPlace Kenya office. That's the images at the right. We had the pleasure of working with the Overseas Development Institute's Humanitarian Policy Group. It's a think tank based out of London, and they came to us with wanting to take a really kind of innovative, collaborative approach to reimagine the global humanitarian architecture. That was their phrasing. Reimagine the global kind of humanitarian system for the 21st century, recognizing that crises are getting more complex and more protracted, and that sort of thing. There's a lot more effort around resilience building now rather than sort of immediate response. So one way we approach this, there's a sort of endless circular conversation to be had right around where does the system start and stop when you talk about something so sort of large scale as the humanitarian system. One thing that helped us was present these kind of different frames. So if we thought, so let's take the top circle there. If we thought about the humanitarian system today as kind of a fire truck model is how we started referring to it. So kind of this massive crisis response kind of service, right? It's really focused on immediate response. It's really stripped down. It's really fit for purpose, and it's just focused on that acute emergency response. What then would it look like? How would it play out? How would we design for it to address those types of problems? The second one being like a starfish model. We started referring to it as a starfish model, but it was the idea of a more networked approach. So if we operated more as a network, a set of institutions that are kind of specialized but complementary, how would that look? How could we design for that? The last being a cooperative model that's really kind of marketplace focused. So how could the humanitarian system match demand with supply? And how does that sort of lens or frame then help us think about the problems differently? So I think that was the inspiration for this exercise today, kind of helping us think about consortia or partnerships by drawing on different analogies from different spaces.
Thanks, Carly. And we are coming to the last section of our presentation. So we've covered sort of why you might use social innovation. We've covered what it could look like and what some of the common pitfalls are. Now we'd like to help you turn it into action by talking to you a little bit about some of those kind of remedies that you can use against the common pitfalls. So again, they were partnering without doing the groundwork, having a misalignment in values between a donor or a sponsor of a project and the project team, and doing the whole set and forget and not applying reflective practice. So our first kind of action that we would encourage you to take if you're entering into partnerships or consortia and you're keen to take a social innovation approach to it is to get really clear on your intent as a group and with your sponsor before you jump into any action. And the questions you can ask in this time are, who's at risk if nothing changes? Who has a role in making the change a reality? And depending on who comes out of those two questions, you could be asking, what would success look like for those people if we actually achieved this intent? And then it's a conversation around, well, what's our first step together? So to give you a bit of an example or a case study from Australia, recently, this year, I have been working on another innovation lab with the water sector in Australia. So we've been working with 30 to 40 utilities around Australia to help them define their top technology innovation roadmap that will set their course and their investment in technology for the next 4 years. So we actually chose to take a social innovation approach with that. And what that meant is that we had an entire process before the design process. And that was around really understanding the problem well, really understanding what we were trying to achieve collectively. And then we began a process of looking at what a future system might look like. So we skipped over what are we going to do with the current system and decided let's just create the future system. And through that, where we now have a set of narratives, and they're things like the sector is co-created between customers and utilities. The loop has been closed on water supply and demand, and therefore we're creating new value from waste products. We're giving back to nature rather than drawing from it. And our sectors are integrated and driven by communities and enabled by technologies. So those are the sorts of stories we're telling about this future that we're looking to create. And our next step after all of the hard work this year, getting clear on that intent, is now to start working backwards and saying, well, what do we need to do to get to that future? Carly, I'll throw to you the next two.
Yeah, sure. So this is in response to that pitfall again around values misalignment. So what you see on the screen is a model that ThinkPlace likes to use in response to that, to make sure that we have the right balance of perspectives and expertise in the room at the same time and consistently throughout the process. So, so the voice of intent there at the top, that's of course the person or people who are kind of holding the vision of what change needs to happen and sort of has sponsored this process or is sort of holding the idea of what's stimulating the change, what's stimulating this whole process. So that person sort of keeps us on track and makes sure that we, don't sort of veer from that vision. The voice of intent there to the right, the voice of design, excuse me, is the broker for the process. We like to think about the person kind of managing and making sure that we're working on the process, and the process isn't just sort of working to solve the problem, like Sarah was just saying there. Someone who's got their eye sort of to that whole piece of it. The voice of expertise there at the bottom is someone who really understands, who really kind of has that in-depth knowledge of what's going on, or sort of the subject matter expert or the technical expert who can come in and sort of help sense check and stress test some of the solutions we might be developing, or help us kind of have that more expert perspective. And then voice of experience in human-centered design and design thinking is a kind experience as a kind of treated as a kind of expertise. So this is the person that's closest to the problem or who's personally experienced the problem. So that piece of the system that we're trying to address. Usually this is a whole host of people or a set of target groups or target population. So yeah, having these sort of four voices all together really helps tackle that question around values misalignment, because you can kind of have those work through some of those tough problems together from the outset. And then lastly, so this one was in response to that pitfall around set it and forget it. As we've said, having someone who has their eyes on the process. So Sarah and I were talking earlier, and I was saying there's kind of a difference in our world at ThinkPlace of working on the business and working for the business, right? And I think it's similar here, where as much as we want to innovate in terms of our problem solving and the outcomes, and we're all sort of outcome focused, there's also innovation within the process itself. So the process itself brings a kind of innovation in the way that we work, the modes of working, the styles of working, all of that sort of thing. So our sort of suggestion here, recommendation here, is to dedicate someone who can really manage their process and keep their eye on that, and make sure that you can adapt and pivot if you need to. So, really having moments, having that reflective practice. You can have moments to reflect on the process itself and make sure it's not really constraining you, it's actually working for you and with you. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Carly, and thank you everyone for your fantastic participation. I'm so delighted that so many of you jumped into Slido, and I'm really excited to hear any questions that you may have. I've popped a link into this slide deck, which we'll share after, if you're interested in reading the social innovation report that we've prepared, and you'd like to go into a little more detail than what we were able to today. Over to you, Deb.
Thank you, Sarah and Carly. I love those slides. Just made me realise, and I was thinking through the emphasis I use every day. I'm going to start with a bit of a question, because on one of the slides you talk, you're talking about lived experience. You know, the individual lens, the expert lens, and that we really need to look at that lens in the context of the system. What's your advice around that? Because, you know, we have really a revolution going on, rightly so, about lived experience, you know, driving much more in the driver's seat, but clearly lived experience and those with high degrees of knowledge in the context of the system is the right balance. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Because it's very topical at the moment.
Yeah, maybe we could tackle it, one from kind of an international development perspective and one from a domestic perspective. In terms of some of the innovation labs that I've been working on, the way we've been bringing in the voice of experience is that we actually give them a seat at the table in our ideation events. So what you'll find is you might have a table of 6 or 7 people, and recently there've been virtual tables, let me note. And on that table you might have, you know, someone who is from an energy network, someone who is a regulator or a policymaker. You might have a commercial customer, you might have a residential customer, and they're all working together to define a problem, which in essence is a process of building empathy with each other. So we'll use mediums like empathy mapping tools, or we'll use role playing as a way to make that happen. The other thing is that we also test our ideas with people with lived experience, and we are not afraid to throw ideas away if we're told that it won't work. In some of our A-Lab events, when we get to the final stage where people are getting ready to pitch ideas, we'll actually also get them to pitch to customers. So I actually had a team pitch to my mum, who is a pensioner, and she really gave them a serve about concessions and how it all works at the moment. So that was really interesting. But there are lots of different and creative and sensitive ways that you can bring in the voice of experience, and Carly can probably speak to those more sensitive ways given the topics that she's been covering in her projects.
Carly, do you want to make a comment? I've got another question for you before we, so would you like to make a comment about?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely have plenty to share on the sort of ethical and safeguarding front, but I think more just at a practical level, you know, I do think sometimes, as we've said, lived experience is kind of this is brought into the process, or users sometimes we call them, are brought into the process, but it's sort of a predetermined process. And I think something that we've been, you know, really intentional about, and Sarah certainly in her work is making sure that they're actually part of kind of co-constructing that process and designing it from the beginning.
Yeah.
Oftentimes those who are closest to the problem, of course, have that passion and that motivation to solve it. So bringing them in from the beginning is important.
Yeah, yeah. So we've got a great question here from Daryl Hinger that I want to pose to both of you. So thinking more globally, are there examples in which political or structural circumstances restrict social innovation, and how do you work around that? That's a great question, Daryl. Who's going to go first?
That's a great question. We're going to have to tackle this together, Carly. I'm thinking about a project that you and I worked on together in Myanmar with the Red Cross there, where we were looking at building a toolkit for coalitions and how they can come together around specific problems related to disasters and disaster resilience. And an example of political or structural circumstances was kind of the power dynamic that was present in a lot of the sessions that we were running and the interactions that we created. So one of those kind of leveling agents or tools that we used to manage those were to give people physical mediums to work with and to talk around. And we used storytelling as a way for people to place an idea in something that could hold it, and that would allow others to look at it from different lenses. And I have to say, you know, I heard back from those who were in the field in our second workshops, and they were saying that it was just incredible that you had, you know, community members working with the minister and talking about these crazy Lego models that they'd created and what that would look like if they were to make it real. So that's one example. It's probably a very simplistic example, Daryl. Maybe Carly can add to that as well.
Yeah, I've got a few examples, some sort of like really practical things, and then other sort of more conceptual things. But I'll just give you a snapshot of a workshop that we did with some men from the Ministry of Health in Somalia. So obviously a country that's been through cycles of drought and conflict for quite some time. And we were working on a maternal health project. So women were sort of accessing antenatal care and postnatal care really intermittently and not sort of consistently. So we were kind of trying to tackle that problem. But the Ministry of Health obviously invested in solving the problem, but somewhat removed, I think, from who those people are that would be accessing these services and what the day-to-day looks like at the clinics, for example. So just a small glimpse of what we did in a workshop is we collected some footage, some 360-degree video footage of a few different private and public health clinics and pharmacies and facilities, and set up a VR session where the Ministry of Health reps would come in and put on their VR headsets and experience it, and absolutely loved it. And they had a lot of, we can share some quotes from that, but they had a lot of sort of breakthrough moments, I think. And it's something so simple to feel immersed in that environment, but something I think that they had realized they had lost touch with over the course of the time. Yeah.
I mean, I think that in a way, the process and the discipline that you've provided today in this session is actually really important. I mean, earlier in the chat, the comments about defining the problem again, Daryl Hinger said, defining the problem and the importance of that from the get-go seems to be the secret sauce. If you get that wrong, it can go wrong. Would that be your view? Can you come back from that?
Can you come back from it?
Yeah.
Great question, Dan. Yeah, you can always come back. That's the beauty of working in a design process, is that it encourages reflection and review and understanding constantly of where you're going and are you on the right track. And sometimes you do realize that you get out there and the assumptions you made about a problem are really tested, and that problem doesn't exist, and it's actually quite a different problem. And so, yeah, you absolutely can come back to it. But again, it means that you've got to have someone who's got their eye on that process and is really starting to understand what are the linkages between the outcomes that we're getting, the impact that's being achieved, and the original problem that we set out to tackle.
Well, I've got one final comment, and I mean, I love the answer to that question, because to be honest, sometimes we don't want to admit really that we've defined the problem not quite right. But I think that your process encourages us to continue to refine our thinking and not be afraid to backtrack, which I think is really, really important. What I would say in closing, Sarah and Karli, is how do you think, we've got a lot of sector people here today from across a number of sectors, particularly in the child, youth and family services space. What would you suggest we do now in taking some of your work forward? What would be a couple of the steps that you would suggest we do? Apart from they're here today, we can send the information out. What would you suggest we do now? Just a really simple question, really, Sarah and Karli.
Karli, can I throw to you first this time?
Well, you know, what immediately came to mind is that I think sometimes this can feel a bit daunting, and it feels like a process that you've got to sort of map onto something you're already doing. It can feel a bit clunky. But that was kind of our intention in sort of going through the pitfalls and giving you kind of these little sound bites and things that you can kind of take away. Yeah, but the thing that came to mind is to sort of a couple of different exercises. So one Sarah and I have talked about recently in preparing for this was when you're sort of looking to redesign the way something works, what we often do is sort of list out the characteristics or features or qualities of it that we currently experience. So for instance, we all know Uber, right, is an incredibly disruptive business model. But if you kind of list out the qualities of your experience in the average taxi ride, and then you flip those on their head, so you sort of, if you think about the other side of the sheet of paper or whatever you're working with, you take the direct opposite of that, then you've got the sort of the qualities of, say, the Uber experience. We've done that kind of exercise in a workshop. Or in Kenya one time, we were redesigning a technical working group, like a subcommittee kind of experience. And we sort of had people list out all the characteristics of that and then flip it on its head. And it's kind of liberating. It gives people space to rethink something that is an old and tired practice, or kind of unthink something that's kind of worn out, and just give people the time and space to do that. I think it really is kind of, in the literature, it's called psychological safety, but really kind of giving people that time and space to think more liberally about what they can do differently.
Very sage advice. Sarah, did you want to say anything? I just think that's very sage advice. I mean, taking time out, sitting back and actually really thinking about something that has had its time and you might want to do it differently, I think is always really good.
Yeah, and look, my comment was really building upon that. But Carly, I love the flip it idea, because we're actually hardwired for critique. We're really good at complaining about things, but we find it really hard to find the good things. So if you focus your brain on brainstorming the worst of something, you can often flip it and come up with the best. But that taking time out and space to reflect is really important. So the one thing that I would leave with you is that it's okay to stop at any time and review your arrangements. And you can ask 3 simple questions: what's working well, what needs to change, and what needs to stop. And you remember, you need to ask those questions of the different layers of your consortia or your partnerships or your approaches, because they're multifaceted. So there's the people, there's the process, and there's the intent and the goal. And you need to ask those questions of all of those features. So that's the one thing I'll leave with you.
Oh my goodness, Sarah, how you managed to do that. That's just so helpful. Thank you so much, especially on a Friday, hey? A Friday afternoon as we're heading towards Christmas. And, 28 days of 0 COVID cases as well. I know, very exciting, particularly for Victorians who've lived through a very difficult time. I just want to say thank you from everybody here today for being able to pack so much into an hour, and to give people some really short, sharp advice about how to take this content forward, because actually, more important than ever during COVID, we need to think a little bit differently. I love to comment about being hardwired to think about the things that really annoy us, and trying to move out of that. What can we do differently? And I actually think we've seen a lot more of that during COVID than in our recent history. So we need to keep that way of thinking going. So thank you so much, Sarah and Carly. Thanks for being with us today, and thank you for everybody who has been online. Thank you to my gorgeous colleagues at VADA and VHA. We love doing the Tri-Peaks work together. Working together has been remarkable, and when I looked at your values slide, I realised how aligned the 3 of us are and how we've made some magic this year around the Tri-Peaks work, in what has been in really tough times. I also want to thank Emma Femby and Oliver behind the scenes who make these webinars so slick and so interesting, and that we get great attendance, because people can get some ideas and freshen, give a bit of a refresh to some of the things they thought they knew, give them a bit of a lick of paint. So thank you so much, Sarah and Carly. Have a great Christmas. with family and friends. And I'm sure that Emma's got some other work up her sleeve to get you to come back and talk to us again in the new year. So thank you so much, everybody. Take care.